Hello, I'm Jonathan Bowman-Perks, and welcome back to my favorite time of the week. And for this week's Inspiring Leadership series, I am delighted to have an old friend of mine, Daron Seukeran. Daron and I have known each other for 15 years, and he has been quite an inspiration to me. Now he's the Group Medical Director of SKN, and particularly the laser clinic side of that, which he's an expert in. He's also a consultant dermatologist at the NHS James Cook Hospital in Teesside. Daron, welcome to the series. Great to have you on.
Thank you.
So let's go firstly into what you're doing at the moment, and then we'll perhaps jump back to your early childhood and how it's shaped the leader you are today. So tell me what you're doing at the moment and some of the work that you've been doing.
So as you said, I'm a consultant dermatologist, which at the James Cook University Hospital in Teesside, which covers the areas between we've got York to the south of us, we've got Newcastle to the north of us, and we're right in that middle area. And so we cover a large population. It was very a deprived population at one point. So we had quite a lot of different types of illnesses and so on that we cover. And as a dermatologist, we're seeing huge amounts of skin problems, skin cancers, and different areas from that point of view. So basically, as a skin specialist on Teesside, that's where I started 20 years ago now here. Right. But my subspecialty has been laser surgery. And in laser surgery, one of the main things that we do is we deal with things like children who may have birthmarks from birth. So in effect, big red marks. You may see in a child with a red mark on one side of their face called a port wine stain. So technology has improved that we can now treat these sort of birthmarks with a view to clearing them as best as we can before a child gets to school, for instance. So that psychological impact that it used to have is much lessened. But like computers, lasers have improving all the time. So there's other sorts of treatments that we can do that used to be the remit of surgery, but we can now do with lasers, which are less invasive, healing times faster. So to give you an example of that, it's things like acne scarring, burn scars, scars due to road traffic accidents, people with just red areas on their faces, or people with deformities of noses. There's all sorts of things that can be done. And so it's an exciting field to be in as our technology improves.
And it's lovely that the passion you have for the work you do. And let's perhaps go back when we were chatting, and I went out some years ago to Trinidad and Tobago, which is where you originally came from, and thanks to you, we had a nice holiday out there, and loved the place and the people. Just take us back to your early childhood, and I seem to remember you saying when you were 5, you thought, I'm going to become a doctor. So tell us the story of one or two of the people who've influenced you to become the leader you are today.
Well, it was kind of interesting because I was actually born in England, in London, and my parents were from Trinidad, and you hear about a lot of people who came over from the West Indies and thought, oh, we'd like to go back to the Caribbean, but never do. However, my father really hated winter. And so at the age of 8, he was a lawyer, finished his training here, and we did go to Trinidad. So I left here and ended up in Trinidad from the age of 8 to 18, which you can imagine is a really important time of life in terms of going to school and growing up. The idea of becoming a doctor, it's interesting. I remember having tonsillitis at the age of a relatively young age, and you'd think that might put you off for life, but somehow that kind of introduced me to medicine and that side of it. And from that point in time, it became something that I was always interested in doing.
And who was it that sort of shaped the kind of leader you are today? What moments in your life journey have shaped you?
It's interesting. You look at different stages of life. So there's no question that my parents were instrumental in this. I I kind of watched my dad as a very calm, clear thinker in a way. He worked in the legal side of banking, and we had a way with people, and that was the thing that I really enjoyed. Whether it didn't matter who he was dealing with, there was a sort of ease of that I appreciated. My mom was, she was a dress designer, used to design wedding dresses and things like that, and actually had her own boutique in Trinidad, with a very creative side of things. And again, from her came that point of, don't be afraid to try something. Don't let anybody tell you can't do something. We all want as parents to instill that in our children, but there was something very clear about that to me in terms of what was going on. I think following that, when we moved to Trinidad, there was a doctor who lived next door to me as a neighbor, and this guy's name was Richard Keeler. Now, he came over to Trinidad to work in leprosy, and not only that, he worked as a missionary in Trinidad in the Caribbean. And what really stood out to me was, yes, he was a doctor, but there was a much bigger picture to this. His faith as a Christian and looking at the bigger picture was what drove him and gave him a purpose. And, we ended up I ended up going to Sunday school in that church and grew up in that area. And that definitely had an idea that, yes, there was medicine, but also there was a bigger purpose to what this was all about. And that did, had an impact. And then I guess the final thing was, as you move forward, was my wife. Linda and I, we look back, we were only 22 when we met, at university and moving forward. But through all these different phases of life, again, that support and that kind of willingness to say, look, go out and take a chance, again, made quite a difference in being able to take some of the risks that I've done.
Yeah, like most people's partners, Linda, I think, has been very, very patient and very long suffering with the crazy ideas that you have. And we'll go and do this and we'll go and do that. And she'll go, really? But if you met the younger Daron and you were to give him some advice, the 18-year-old who was perhaps leaving Trinidad and Tobago and coming back, what bit of advice would you give him that it serve other people as well? A bit of sound advice that you wish you'd known then.
That in many ways, yeah, be positive. Have that sense that at 18, you sometimes think you can conquer the world. You're going to go forward, and you might have the support of your parents, friends, teachers telling you can do anything, but be ready that something is going to come, and literally from left field, it's going to surprise you. Something will go wrong. There will be a hurdle that you may not have expected you're going to come across. And the thing about that is not to be surprised by it. It's the nature of what life is about. It's what's going to happen to all of us. But be ready so that when it happens, and even if it takes you off your feet and you fall, just be ready to get back up, dust yourself off, and move forward. Because it's when you have that first big disappointment or shock or something unfortunate happens. I think, we know about this, but the difference between those who just can move forward are those who just will say, okay, didn't expect that, but I'm not going to let it completely take me out forever.
Yeah, very, very wise bit of advice. I agree with that. And it's actually very stoical in its philosophy. I've been reading a lot of it and find it very influenced by it. And this, that, things will go wrong. Life is difficult and life isn't fair. Get on with it. And don't bleat about it and expect someone to rescue you. You got to pick yourself up, learn from it, and move on. And what about, talking about learning from things, what about some of your proudest moments and some of the darkest moments in your work or your life, and what you learned from it and how it's shaped you?
Proudest moments, I think, you can look at that in different ways, professionally, personally. In some ways, my proudest moments have been watching my children as they go forward and move forward in life. I guess every parent, you look at your children and think, look, you're trying to lay a foundation. In fact, you just want to see them do even better than you ever were able to do. And I think for me, seeing them be able to express themselves and move forward, again, in the face of adversity, I find that really makes me feel proud.
Just on that one, Darren, how many children have you got? Just explain, and what have you seen them achieve in their time so far?
I've got 4 girls, and you know, we had our 2 older girls when we were relatively young, at the age of 25, and then we had a 7-year gap, and our other 2 girls. So it was almost like having 2 families in some ways. And what I've learned from that was, you would think that your children, you've had a chance to get better at it as you get the younger 2, but the reality is every one of your children is such an individual, such a character, and you think, how did 4 children grow up in the same household and they all can be so different in many ways? I love that diversity and aspect of it.
Yeah. And what about a dark moment and what you learned from that, Darren?
I think a dark moment was, again, I remember, that was a story in itself, but I trained initially in general practice because I came out of medical school and didn't really know what I wanted to do. I found many areas of medicine interesting, and I thought, well, okay, I'll go into an area where I get a chance to do most things. But after I finished my training, I had a real sense that, yes, I could see myself quite enjoying general practice, an incredibly important role. But I also began to realize that there was something about my personality that I felt I needed to be an expert in one area. And as I could see the speed at which medicine was changing over the years, that it would be easier to be an expert in one area than be abreast of everything. So I decided, instead of going into partnership in general practice at the end of 4 years, that I would decide to aim to apply to dermatology. Now, dermatology is one of the most competitive specialties in medicine to get into, partly because it's a relatively small specialty with only a limited number of places per year. And I had taken a year where I was working in Canada when I was making this big decision. Do I go into general practice, or do I specialize? And I flew. Now, remember, I was only, I think, 29 or 30, and limited amounts of money. I flew all the way back to the UK to apply to go for an interview for a dermatology job. And this wasn't a proper training job. It was like a junior job, just to get back into the field with a view to hopefully being able to apply for something more substantial. And I remember having flown in all the way from Canada, gone to this interview in Liverpool, and I didn't get the job. And I remember thinking, if I can't even get a junior job in dermatology, what chance do I ever have of being able to get a proper training position? And I remember walking back to the train station after the bad news and sitting there thinking, this is it, it's all over. But I went back up to a friend's house, a friend of mine called Pat Puen. And Pat was a great friend and support. And she had been sort of getting my mail and things for me when I was in Canada. And we had all these letters from different departments, some being supportive, some saying, to be honest, because you did general practice, you got no chance of getting into dermatology. But just there was a BMJ, so the British Medical Journal. It was open, and I looked at the ads in terms of jobs, and there was a job available for what we call a registrar position, which is a significant training position. Now, when I look back at it, it was an awful time. I had just flown back from Canada, spent a lot of money, didn't get the job. And then suddenly I saw this advertisement for a better job. And I thought, well, is there any point applying? You couldn't even get this basic one. What's the point of applying for that? But it was at that moment, again, with the support, when you look back, support of friends like Pat at that moment, my wife, my parents, and that kind of saying, look, you don't give it, just push forward, and applied for that, and to cut a long story short, got that job. Now, that was the job that moved me forward to my position today. But when you look back at it, it would have been so easy at that moment in time to have just said, forget it, go and take a job in general practice and move on. And I'm not saying I wouldn't have been happy in general practice, because there's many parts of me that I think would, lend itself to being a good general practitioner. But yeah, that was quite a low moment.
What a great story, and also not giving up and just taking another chance. And I think the thing that has stuck in my mind with you is you've taken quite a few risks during your life, and sometimes it's been difficult, but you've always managed to find a way out. And also you're talking about when you're on one of the courses, how you actually cope well in a crisis, because you found that some people go A, B, C, D, and so you go from A to E. Tell us a bit more about that, and risky and getting into trouble and stuff like that.
Well, sometimes you begin to understand a little bit of the way you work, and I was one of the people who kind of realized from a long time ago, I'll get things done, but I was not the best time manager. I would look at people around me, and they're incredibly meticulous and organized. They would have, whether it be a diary or whatever, and they would be very clear and work their way through to whatever was going on. And I remember I went on, as consultants, we often go on these leadership courses, and there were 20 people in a room, and we did this sort of testing of sorts, and there were 18 of the consultants at one extreme of this chart, and there were 2 of us at the other. And basically what we're saying was, if you were given a task, how do you get from the beginning to the end? And it was, most people would say, okay, I'll work it through, and they would have X number of steps and work through, let's say, A to E and get the outcome. But what they said was, for the 2 of us, was, you guys are the best for putting into a crisis scenario. You will get from A to E, and you'll get there very quickly. But the difficulty for those around you is they can't quite work out how you got from A to E, because you're not laying out the steps of B, C, D. For me, that was eye-opening, because what I realized is that even though I wasn't what I thought was the best time manager, and I had read every book there was on time management, how do you do it? Do you lay out lists or whatever? I suddenly realized, yeah, I do get where I want to be, but it helped me to stop being so hard on myself. I thought, realize who you are. I am not going to be the best logical time manager, but I did understand my strength of getting outcomes. So one of the things from that was I suddenly stopped trying to read every area about time management, and then realized what was the things that I needed to put in place. Because it's one thing getting an outcome, but you still, if you're leading, you've got to be able to bring those around you with you along the journey. So what I started realizing, having really good people around me, like my secretaries, Samantha and Lisa, are unbelievable at setting up structures around me. So I will let us know where we're going, but by having that in place, it would also help those around me understand where we're going. And I think that's like an important area. If you can understand who you are, yes, understand the weaknesses and the strengths, but don't fight it too hard, because there are times that I know, no matter how hard I try, I could never become the most meticulous time manager with a system. But I also understand, yes, so there are certain areas I can do better, and I will take some of the principles, but I'll also bring in those around me to make it better.
Yeah, last night, sometimes I find when I'm sort of awake in the early hours of the morning, I'll put on my headphones and listen to an audiobook. And I was re-listening to Atomic Habits by James Clear, which I recommend to everybody. And he talks about setting up the right environment where you just cannot fail but do a habit, such as putting your running shoes right beside the bed. So you get out of bed and there are your running shoes and your gym kit, and you just put it on without having to think about it. Or making certain foods that you shouldn't be eating not available. They're, you know, they're in a back cupboard in the back kitchen, and you can't get to them easily. Whereas stuff that you want to be eating, like the carrots and the hummus, is sitting on the kitchen table along with fruit. Just great habits and great tips that he does. Talking about habits, quick habits of a successful person. Your bit on keeping healthy, tip on money and wealthy, and a bit of advice, wisdom.
Well, physically, there's no question that just being regular with exercise. The thing I find about exercise, and I can go through phases where I will work, you know, really well, and I'll go for several months, and then something will happen where you stop, and then I can go for several months without doing something. So without a doubt, one of my weaknesses. But so the idea of just being consistent and doing a small amount regularly rather than trying to do the big event like a marathon or something, is where I see the advantage of that. Money, really interesting area again. One of the things I realized, you know, I think many people have an idea that as physicians we earn well, and we do. But one of the things I realized a long time ago was that when you're working and your time and skill is what you are earning from, you're quite vulnerable. It doesn't take much in terms of, you know, for whatever reason, something could happen where you couldn't work or apply that level of expertise in your field, and suddenly it can change quite dramatically. So I think, again, it was just reading from an early age, I began to realize what's this difference about passive income versus active income. So the idea of creating investments that would potentially help you to earn while you're not working as such was important. Now, many of us, when we're in our 20s and 30s, we don't have the ability to do that. But understanding the principle is very important, because if you start thinking like that, you begin to start looking for the possible opportunities that might come your way, or working with others to do that. So, and then the other thing for me was understanding certain areas. So we all know about things like stocks and shares. We all know about property. We all know that these are things that can help. But you begin to understand that not everybody who tells you they're an expert is an expert. So just becoming literate in these areas, and it's not that difficult with all the information out there on the internet or working, just becoming sensible enough to understand what these things are, so that maybe you can have a better idea of who to ask for help, or when you can make your own decisions. I think that's quite helpful in that way.
Very good. Before we go into the wisdom, of course, we met both doing an online share trading course about 15 years ago. You went on to be much more sensible with money. I ended up losing a lot of money investing in Cyprus, which thank God you didn't get too deeply involved in. But it is interesting how we try and learn how to, you know, as it were, become financially independent. And I've got a long way to go to get there. But what about the wisdom? What about the wisdom bit?
Well, I think, you know, what you just said, Jonathan, is that if you are going to learn to do something in terms of finance, I read something where it says, you know, you can't go down this route expecting never to lose. Hopefully you just win more than you lose. And that's the reality. You know, I've heard it called a wealth wound. You are going to make mistakes, and you can't really invest if you're going to be that scared of losing. So to a certain extent, it's being ready to accept that there may be losses. But on the other side, it's also being sensible enough to be able to limit those losses so that it does not take you out of the game. And that's absolutely crucial in that respect. I think the second area of wisdom for me, I talked to you about, you know, meeting a doctor who was involved in medicine, but also had a bigger purpose. And in many ways, you know, my Christian faith of having that greater sense that there is a bigger purpose to life and just direction, and what your value is to others around, I think makes a big difference. Because if you see it in that context, you don't get caught up in this world of, well, it's all about my career and how great, and if it's going well or it's not going well. Sometimes you think, look, sometimes life is going to take you in its twists and turns. But in the big picture, maybe it's all going to work out.
Yeah, good wisdom. And if you were to pick a leader who you found inspiring that you'd like to talk about and you think should be on the series, who would you recommend?
You can look back at different stages. I think right now, somebody I've been working with is a chap called Daron Grasby, who's the CEO of SKN. Daron and I have worked together, and I work from the medical perspective of the standards of the organization. He works on the commercial structure. But in a very difficult time of, I guess, when you think of the crash of 2008 and what's been going on, and now we've got the COVID scenario, there's been a lot of changes, a lot of difficulties going on. And to take an organization where originally we had something like 7 clinics across the country, where we now have over 100 clinics, but managing that with a team of a diverse group of, whether you've got plastic surgeons, dermatologists, general practitioners, nurses, therapists, and moving that together, but trying to maintain a level of integrity and an ethical side, that what we're providing is healthcare, but trying to work it within the context of a business. I think that has, I've admired that. And what I've admired about Daron is again, willing to put the right people around him, because it's one thing understanding that you might be great commercially, but it's also having the ability to respect the views of those medically. And sometimes for medical reasons, you can't do something commercially and vice versa. So it's really getting a team that works together.
Yeah, that's great. And you were telling me about how during the start of COVID, you thought, I'll go and work in the COVID environment. I'll go and help this. This is where the help is needed, which I have great respect for you, that you put yourself in such a risky situation to help others greatly in need. But that fits with your life calling and your faith, which I understand and respect massively. Talk to us about how COVID impacted you personally, both family and you with your 4 children. And also how you think the world's going to be with COVID going forward, your predictions of our lifestyle and viruses and vaccines and things like that. Just interested in your views, really.
Well, let me tell you how, in some ways, naive I was. So in about February, early March, when we saw the COVID cases starting to build and it was becoming a reality of what was going on, in my hospital, remember, I'm a skin specialist as a dermatologist. So as a group of dermatologists, we were asked, would you be interested in deploying to either the COVID wards, because we could see the number of cases were building in the hospital, or to the non-COVID wards. Now, as dermatologists, we had trained in general medicine, but remember, that was 20 years ago. So going back onto a ward was going to be different. And at the time, I think we all discussed it and we thought, it'd be better to train further all into the COVID scenario, thinking we can get really good at handling our patients with coronavirus and be more useful and help our colleagues in infectious diseases and medicine. So we volunteered to go onto the COVID wards. And so when we went onto the wards, to be honest with you, at the time, I sort of thought, okay, this is going to be different and challenging. And I also sort of thought, well, we'll probably get it, going onto the wards, might as well just get it and get it over with. So went onto the wards, and then just in about March, I don't know, many of us might remember, there was these on the news, almost every day you started seeing healthcare workers dying. There were doctors, there were nurses, there were people in care homes in terms of healthcare workers. And suddenly it was a bit of a shock to the system. I had never in my medical career felt vulnerable that I would get ill in that respect. And looking at that was the first time I suddenly thought, really? Could this virus actually, affect me and potentially be fatal? And I think you could just sense across all of us in working in the healthcare environment that this reality was becoming real. So that changed everything a little bit, not in terms of how we're working, but the perception of it. So I remember, in terms of you would go into the hospital, you would get into your scrubs and your masks, you'd get onto the wards. Every patient you were seeing was COVID positive. You were trusting that your masks and your visors were doing the job they were meant to do. I would get home, and we had a little cottage outside our home, and I would literally go in there, get changed before even walking into the house. You could sense even from your family, you were worried about passing it on to them. And it was really a very unknown time. What I will say on a really positive note was, watching the whole teams of the hospital come together, whether it was the nurses, the doctors, the ancillary workers, porters, was fantastic. And in many ways, again, as we moved forward and we got better and began to understand what treatments were better, we began to understand maybe what members of staff shouldn't be working on a COVID environment and which ones should. It changed and it got better. In many ways, like everything in medicine, there's a level of respect. You come into a position unknown, you start developing a certain amount of knowledge about it, and you realize that the aspects that the government are playing with in terms of lockdown versus the economy, these are huge difficulties, and we all understand the areas. But when I look at the impact of what's going on in terms of society, people losing their jobs, it is huge. What I will say, in terms, you said, where do I see COVID going? I think the positive areas are, we are better prepared. We are aware of better treatments now. We are hoping that a vaccine will come into play. But the reality is we all want it now, but you've got to be ready to understand that may take longer than we expect. When I look at some of the things that have happened in the past with humanity, the world wars, you look at the cities, the way they were bombed and the destruction at that time. You look at some of the other major pandemics of the past or illnesses. The one thing I do see is you do see humanity come through it. I was listening to on the radio this morning about New Zealand. They just had an All Blacks Australia match with 47,000 people at the match. You can be sitting here in the UK thinking, will we ever see that again? And I think that's really positive that, there's parts of the world coming through this. So, in many ways, my view is we still need to be cautious. We've got a lot of work to do. We still need to respect the consequences of this virus, because the danger is that we all do become a little bit blasé. You think, oh, well, we just got to get on with it. And the thing is, be sensible. And yes, I think we are going to see, as we move forward, a balance between getting back to some level of normality in terms of the way we go about our daily lives. But there's going to be a period where we have to continue taking these precautions.
Yeah, very wise words. And really just a sort of final few thoughts. What would you like your legacy to be, Daron? What would you like your legacy to be, both personally and at work?
Yeah, that's such a difficult question. In many ways, you look at incredible people around the world in terms of what they've achieved and what they've left. I guess a legacy on a personal level is, I kind of look back and think, well, if there was a purpose to just being able to share my faith and confidence with others, that's one. But it's very much looking at, your children, that you think, well, I gave them the opportunity and the freedom to move on with their lives. And if you can just stand back at the end and see them getting on with things, that would be wonderful. From a professional perspective, You know, the privilege we have as physicians is we get to sit one-on-one with people or families and get to know them in a quite an intimate way very quickly. And if all you've done is over a period of time just made some impact on those who've crossed your path, you know, that would be great. I think from the laser perspective, I would love to think that some of the work that I have done has been, again, able to impact on certain people who may not have had the funding or ability to get that in the past, and that we can continue to move more treatments as they become available within the context of the NHS, and that is a service that we'll be able to preserve and develop in the future.
Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge that you have a lovely way with people, and I think the talent that you've developed over the years of listening well to people, really empathizing with them, drawing out from them, being fascinated by the people that you meet, whatever their background, without any judgment. I find you're very non-judgmental about people and curious about people and curious about new things and trying things out. I just want to acknowledge that that is a skill that I think you've got, which you use well. And some in the medical profession have that skill. Others are very technically good at what they do, but sometimes they don't read people the way you do. And I just want to acknowledge that. What about finally a book or a couple of books that you've found powerful in your life and that you'd recommend to people?
Well, if I could just go back just before that to what you just said. I mean, the thing I think about people is that it's amazing. I can be sitting down in a consultation talking about, you know, a skin problem, and I might make the diagnosis in 5 minutes. But what is fascinating in the context of meeting someone is you start listening to their lives, and it is amazing. People from every walk of life and background, they have a story, and there is something that you will learn, and the insights you can get from someone that you least expect, I find fascinating. And I think whatever you do, if you are just interacting with people in the context of what you do, that's one side of it. But don't be afraid to just get behind whatever it is, and it opens up a whole new world where it no longer seems like work.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think even if you're just you're handling calls on a telephone to people, it's interesting. I think that comes out, and I've learned so much from people. Like, I'll give a very quick example. So, you know, we had a healthcare person in the room who didn't know much about lasers at all, and sometimes when I'm doing laser surgery, I might lift up my safety goggles to check that everything's okay, and then I put it back down and fire the laser. And when she was in the room, when I lifted up my goggles, she lifted up her goggles, and it was really interesting because we both suddenly realized the danger of what had happened. Because if I had put my goggles now, not realizing what she had done, I could have fired a laser and caused great harm. And it was the concept of just both of us kind of immediately dawning on each other what had happened, her understanding, or not quite understanding the significance of what can happen if you fire a laser without goggles. And that then became a safety feature with it. I then went to lecture nationally on that, explaining to massive rooms of doctors of, listen, how dangerous this simple thing can be. And it's picking up that when you least expect it. So again, just that idea that everybody you meet has something and storing something unique. And if you seek that out, I find it really interesting.
You are
I guess
just before you go into the book, I just want to pick up on that because it's so profound. I read recently the book or listened to the audiobook because my dyslexia, I tend to listen to books more than read. I can read, but I find listening much more interesting. And it was called Life is in the Transitions. I recommend it to you. Life is in the Transitions. And this person did a whole series of interviews with people and asking them about their life stories. And he found it fascinating, and that we have a major life transition on average every 18 months. So it could be a death or a change of job or birth of a child or somebody leaving home or whatever it might be. And that we think we'll get back to life after we've had that transition. But actually, the interesting part of your life is in the transition. That's when you learn the most about yourself, the high, the low, as we talked about. And I've started to ask people about their life story, and it's a real privilege. And they have told me things that I just, would not have known about. And obviously you hold those confidences because it's during executive coaching and it's, or a conversation with someone, but just real respect for people. And who am I to judge anybody unless I've walked a mile in their shoes or understand a bit of their life? And it makes me somewhat disappointed with myself over the years that I've judged people without ever knowing their story. I don't know whether that resonates for you, Daron.
Yeah, very much so. And you sometimes it will be a chance meeting. You're thinking, oh, I really can't be bothered going to this dinner tonight or whatever. You sit down at a table, somebody completely unknown sits next to you, and suddenly it can be a life-changing conversation that could take you in a completely different direction.
Like talking to you on a course about share options. So finally, your book choices and why you'd recommend them and what they are.
I think, it's probably, when I look back, there's two books I would recommend. The first is a book by Stephen Covey, which is very well known in terms of the 7 Habits. But he wrote a second book called First Things First. And that book was the one that I found quite really interesting, because it was about understanding what was the key in the important areas, what was valuable and important, and also beginning to understand how quickly we go to the unimportant and less valuable, because it's easy to live in that world of and nothing's wrong with it in the right context, but sometimes when things are tough, we quickly go to certain activities or behaviors. So having read that at a relatively young age, that kind of helped me to understand what I was doing. So if I was doing something like just sitting there watching Netflix, that's fine if that's what I chose to do. But if I was doing it because I was just simply trying to avoid actually something important, at least I understood what I was doing. And then on the other side, it was again understanding what was important and valuable, because sometimes there's a lot of important things out there, but most of the times we're firefighting in crises. And it's always the urgent and important stuff that is dominating our time all the time. But it was understanding that if you can spend a little bit more time in the non-urgent but important areas and planning in those areas, that is the area that will absolutely change your life. And if you read any of the wisdom literature, success literature over the years, they all keep on coming into that area. There's nothing new about that. There's nothing, in terms of that I'm saying anything that most of you probably wouldn't know already. But I think getting that deep inside, so you understand where you are during your day, can make all the difference as you move forward.
Well, Daron Seukeran, thank you very much indeed. As always, I knew you'd be inspiring, and also that humility and the humanity and a bit of sense of fun, as well as a clear sense of purpose. So really lovely having you on the series. Thank you, Daron.
Thank you.